From New York, this is Democracy Now!
I had gone there for a visa to America. In the northeast of the airport, there was a very strong and powerful suicide attack in the middle of the people. Many were killed, including Americans. Many were killed and many injured.
At least 95 Afghans and 13 U.S. troops have been killed after a pair of suicide bombings in Kabul near the international airport, as thousands of Afghans are desperately trying to flee the country following the takeover by the Taliban. The militant group ISIS-K claimed responsibility. President Biden's vowed to take revenge.
We will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hunt you down and make you pay.
Who is ISIS-K? We go to Kabul for the latest. Then we speak to Olivia Troy, a former top aide to Vice President Mike Pence. She says the racist hysteria of Trump advisor Stephen Miller helped gut the program to resettle Afghan allies in the United States. Plus, we look at how right-wing radio host Larry Elder, who once mentored a young Stephen Miller, could become the next governor of California if voters back a recall of Gavin Newsom. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A warning to our audience. We begin headlines with a story with disturbing video. In Afghanistan, a pair of suicide bombers struck near the crowded gates of Kabul's airport Thursday, where thousands of Afghans had gathered in an attempt to flee the Taliban takeover. At least 110 people were killed, most of them Afghan civilians. 12 U.S. Marines and a U.S. Navy medic were among the dead. The Taliban reports 28 of its members were killed. Scores of people were wounded. The militant group ISIS-K, which is an arch-rival of the Taliban, claimed responsibility. President Biden addressed the nation Thursday, vowing to take revenge.
We will respond with force and precision at our time, at the place we choose, in the moment of our choosing.
Evacuations from Kabul's airport were halted after Thursday's attack, but later resumed. The United States says it's helped over 100,000 people leave Afghanistan since the Taliban takeover August 14th. After headlines, we'll go to Kabul, Afghanistan, for the latest. The U.S. Supreme Court struck down the Biden administration's temporary moratorium on evictions during the pandemic. In a 6-3 ruling, the court's conservative majority ruled the Centers for Disease Control exceeded its authority and that only Congress had the power to order a pause on evictions. The court's ruling puts an estimated 3.5 million people at risk of eviction in the next 2 months. In a dissenting opinion signed by Justices Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, Justice Stephen Breyer wrote, quote, "These people may end up with relatives in shelters or seeking beds in other congregate facilities where the doubly contagious Delta variant threatens to spread quickly," he wrote. The United States recorded nearly 190,000 new coronavirus infections Thursday and over 1,200 deaths. In Illinois, Democratic Governor J.B. Pritzker has reinstated an indoor mask mandate for all residents, regardless of their vaccination status. In Texas, Republican Governor Greg Abbott has signed an executive order banning all government mandates on COVID-19 vaccines, even the Pfizer-BioNTech shot, which was granted full FDA approval this week. Governor Abbott's order came as Texas hospitalizations approached their highest levels of the pandemic, with half of all intensive care unit beds occupied by COVID-19 patients. Meanwhile, the Centers for Disease Control is warning against use of the drug ivermectin to treat COVID-19 after the unproven treatment was widely promoted on Fox News, prompting a surge of calls to poison control centers from people who've self-administered the drug. Ivermectin is most commonly used to treat parasites in horses and other large animals. There are no randomized control studies showing it benefits COVID patients. The Arkansas Medical Board is investigating one doctor who says he prescribed ivermectin thousands of times, including to Arkansas prisoners. Texas's House of Representatives has advanced sweeping voter rights suppression legislation, with the Republican majority poised to approve the measure today. The legislation would put strict limits on early voting hours, ban drive-through voting, and empower partisan poll watchers inside polling places, something critics say would open the door to racist voter intimidation. Texas Democrats said during Thursday's debate the measures are designed to raise new barriers for voters of color who tend to vote Democratic.
Intentional discrimination against people of color. These are not my words. These are 3 federal courts across this country making 10 findings of that intentional discrimination.
Intentional discrimination against people of a certain race, is that racism?
That is,
Ms. Hinojosa.
Those words, intentional discrimination, I think can be fairly characterized in that manner.
We can talk about racial impacts of this legislation without accusing members of this body of being racist.
If the legislation is approved by Texas House Republicans as expected, it has to be reconciled with a Senate bill. Texas Governor Greg Abbott could sign the measure into law by early September. Israel says it would ease commercial access to the occupied Gaza Strip, allowing imports of goods, equipment and vehicles, as well as granting more entry permits for certain Gazans into Israel. The announcement came after fresh protests at the separation wall Wednesday, demanding an end to the Israeli blockade. Israeli forces fired tear gas and live rounds on a crowd of hundreds, injuring at least 9 people. Israel's also continued to bomb the Gaza Strip in response to incendiary balloons launched from the besieged territory. President Biden's meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett for the first time today after postponing their Thursday meeting due to the attacks in Afghanistan. The heads of state will discuss Iran's nuclear program. President Biden's administration has been in talks about possibly re-entering the Iran nuclear deal, which Israel staunchly opposes. In Venezuela, at least 20 people are dead following heavy rainfall, massive floods and mudslides in the western state of Merida. Over a dozen people are still missing, and more than 1,200 homes have been destroyed. Parts of northern Colombia have also been hit by catastrophic floods and heavy rains that turned roads into rivers. International aid groups are warning more than 12 million people in Iraq and Syria are losing access to water, food and electricity due to the climate crisis, with urgent action needed to combat a severe drought. This is an Iraqi farmer.
My family and I worked on this farm. It's my source of income, and our livelihoods depends on it. Because of the drought, we didn't get anything this year, and there's nothing I can do about it.
Meanwhile, UNICEF warns that without immediate action, over 4 million people in Lebanon, mostly already vulnerable families and children, could soon face critical water shortages. In California, officials issued evacuation warnings around Lake Tahoe as the massive Caldor fire continues to spread. Thick smoke blanketed the usually idyllic Tahoe Basin as firefighters struggled to tame the devastating blaze, which was just 12% contained Thursday. The Dixie Fire, the largest single wildfire in California's history, remains around 45% contained. Tropical storm Ida formed over the Caribbean Sea Thursday, with forecasters warning it could strengthen to a powerful Category 3 hurricane ahead of landfall late Sunday or early Monday on the U.S. Gulf Coast. Louisiana's declared a state of emergency, including for New Orleans, and warned residents to be prepared. 7 U.S. Capitol Police officers are suing former President Trump, members of far-right extremist groups, and organizers of the so-called Stop the Steal rally over the deadly January 6th insurrection. The officers are accusing Trump and his far-right followers of spreading lies and using white supremacist rhetoric as they attempted to overthrow the results of the 2020 presidential election. A federal monitor overseeing New York City jails is sounding the alarm on the brutal conditions inside Rikers Island. In a letter, the monitor said violence at Rikers had skyrocketed this summer and warned of a high level of disorder and chaos, as well as a shortage of staff and lack of basic services for incarcerated people, including access to medical care. The letter also reported at least 4 suicides since December 2020, neglect during the COVID-19 pandemic, and escalating use of force by officers. In related news, the Justice Department has announced it plans to shut down New York's Metropolitan Correctional Center, the jail where convicted serial rapist Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in 2019 of an apparent suicide. The DOJ said the closure might be temporary while it addresses the squalid and dangerous conditions inside the jail. The CEO of Time's Up resigned Thursday amidst the ongoing fallout over its leader's support for disgraced former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. The Washington Post reported this week Tina Chen texted staffers to, quote, stand down from releasing a statement in support of Cuomo accuser Lindsey Boylan. Her resignation comes less than 3 weeks after prominent lawyer Roberta Kaplan resigned as the chair of Time's Up over her role in advising Cuomo on how to respond to the sexual harassment allegations. Time's Up was founded in the wake of the Harvey Weinstein scandal to support survivors of sexual harassment, assault, and discrimination. And Congressmember Ilhan Omar is calling on President Biden to pardon whistleblower Daniel Hale, a former member of the U.S. Air Force sentenced in July to 45 months in prison for leaking classified information exposing the U.S. drone and targeted assassination program. Hale pleaded guilty in March to one count of violating the World War I-era Espionage Act. In a letter to Biden, Omar writes, quote, the legal question of Mr. Hale's guilt is settled, but the moral question remains open. She wrote, I strongly believe that a full pardon or at least a commutation of a sentence is warranted. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin the show in Afghanistan. A warning to our audience, this segment contains graphic video. The death toll from the twin suicide bombings outside the Kabul airport in Afghanistan has reached at least 108. The Associated Press reports at least 95 Afghans have died, as well as 13 U.S. troops. Thursday was the deadliest day for U.S. forces in Afghanistan in a decade. The suicide bombers struck near the crowded gates of the airport where thousands of Afghans had gathered in an attempt to flee the country before the withdrawal of U.S. troops August 31st. Survivors described a horrific scene.
My dear brother, where we were, there was suddenly an explosion. We climbed out of the water and saw that there were many affected. With the explosion, people were hurled everywhere, their brains scattered. There were also foreign forces who were fallen. People started running away, and we got out. I saw at least 400 to 500 people there. The explosion was really powerful. Half were hurled into the water, others on the ground outside. We carried the wounded here on stretchers, and here, my clothes are completely bloodied.
The militant group ISIS-K, which is an arch-enemy of the Taliban, claimed responsibility. In an address to the United States, President Biden defended his decision to abide by the Trump administration's agreement with the Taliban to withdraw U.S. troops, but he vowed to take revenge against the perpetrators of Thursday's attack.
To those who carried out this attack, as well as anyone who wishes America harm, know this: we will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hunt you down and make you pay. I will defend our interests and our people with every measure at my command.
Evacuations from the airport were halted Thursday after the attack, but they've resumed, though many European countries already ended flights out of Kabul. The United States says it has now helped over 100,000 people leave Afghanistan since August 14th. We go now to Kabul, where we're joined by Ali Latifi, Afghan journalist based in Kabul, a correspondent for Al Jazeera English. Ali, thanks so much for joining us once again. Talk about what happened yesterday and the ISIS-K's claim of responsibility.
Sorry. So, right.
If you could start again, Ali, go ahead.
Sorry. Yes. So I spoke to several victims over the last day who had basically described this scene of panic after the bomb went off, because over the last week, the areas around the airport had become inundated with thousands of people, entire families who were essentially just squatting in this squalor of a land, hoping that they could somehow gain the attention of foreign forces or someone else who would let them into the airport and eventually onto a flight to get out of the country. So when the bomb went off, it was literally, they said, people walking on top of one another. People just scrambling and rushing through hordes of thousands of people. I spoke to one family whose daughter went missing, trying to escape the bombing. Because she was younger, she was trying to lead the charge, go ahead of the rest of the family. At some point, by the time she turned around, her family was missing. And her family has spent much of last night and early this morning continuing to look for her, going from hospital to hospital, trying to see if they can find her, to find out that hopefully she's just injured and hasn't, been killed as a part of the stampede or the subsequent bombing. But that's the state of it, is that basically it was, as they described it, mayhem, because as soon as the bomb went up, you had thousands of people who had been there for hours, in some cases days, running to get out as quickly as they possibly could. So that's really sort of the situation at the airport.
The word is, and of course we can't confirm this, that it was at least one suicide bomber from Logar. He'd already been checked actually by perhaps U.S. military. This happened at the Abbey Gate and also near the, the Barron Hotel, which is the base of operations for the British, who are ending their evacuation, where they had already planned to today.
Exactly. And the issue is that outside the gates of the airport, there are Taliban stationed and the CIA-backed former intelligence forces, both of whom are known for their hostility. And they were basically given the orders to keep people away from the airport. And the way both groups have responded is by shooting into the air, chasing after people with hoses, making sure nobody gets too close, nobody lingers. And so there really was it's not as if there was any sort of thorough security check before they got to the gate. And even when they did get inside the gate, because according to CENTCOM, the bomber detonated inside the gate, if I understood correctly. But even by the time he got inside the gate, he hadn't been thoroughly checked. And again, even in that crowd, there were hundreds, maybe even thousands of people there. So getting to, check him properly would have been almost impossible at that point, because, as I said, the security outside the gates of the airport is very haphazard. It's very violent. It's conducted by the Taliban, and it's conducted by the CIA-backed forces, who are known for their brutality and their rights abuses when they were famous for conducting night raids in this country. So that is how you end up with that kind of situation.
Taliban official Thursday called the attacks on Kabul's airport an act of terrorism, adding the presence of foreign forces in Afghanistan are to blame. Can you talk about that?
It's ironic, isn't it, coming from them? And if the presence of foreign forces is to blame, well, the foreign forces are leaving in 4 days, and the Taliban had been working with those foreign forces to take control of the airport, to essentially help them evacuate people, make it possible for them to evacuate people. So on the one hand, they're blaming the foreign forces, which fine, but they're also working with those foreign forces, and they themselves made a deal with Washington for the withdrawal. So the entire thing is ironic coming from them.
So can you talk about the Afghans who are trying to flee the country? Who's being allowed through into the airport? Who's getting out? The U.S. says
almost nobody. Almost nobody.
And yet the U.S. says it's helped over 100,000 people. I think it's something like 150,000 people have left Afghanistan.
Well, I think the question is how many of those were foreigners and how many of them were Afghan. Because I personally in the last week have been in contact with friends of mine, including Afghans who had green cards, who are afraid to take their family to the airport. I've been talking to Afghans who had visas from different countries and were just standing in that line yesterday, and luckily only left, 2-3 hours before the bomb exploded, before the first bomb exploded. So this idea that, thousands and thousands of Afghans are being evacuated every day is not entirely true. Yes, many, many foreigners have been evacuated and will be evacuated, but as of right now, there are still, of course, that there are sort of people just trying to press their luck, taking any document, seeing if they, for instance, we spoke to the family of one man who, his colleague said, you worked for intelligence, come with your intelligence badge, and hopefully the American soldiers will see it and let you through. And then we saw other people who had, very flimsy proof, just certificates and random documents at their disposal, hoping that they could get through. But we also know of people who were very far along in the process, who had green cards, who had visas, who were told to come to the airport but could not get through the crowds and could not make it into the actual airport. So we really need to keep that in mind, the fact that this system was not built to get the Afghan people in. If anything, it emboldened the Taliban and the CIA-backed forces to be more brutal and more hostile and more confrontational with people trying to get in. And at the same time, all of these governments over the last few months have been advertising that they would have these visa processes and that, they would give people visas and saying that they expanded the parameters of those visas. But going through that process is, it's like a labyrinth. It's not clear-cut. It's not straightforward. And so a lot of people were left behind because of paperwork, simply.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that later in the broadcast, how difficult, especially the Trump administration, with Steve Miller, the advisor.
But it's not just the Trump administration. We have to be honest. I don't think we can take this viewpoint of Trump bad, everyone else good. This continued under the Biden administration, and it's under the Biden administration that this has happened. So I don't think we should just be pinning this on Trump.
So let me finally ask you about attacks on journalists. You wrote about Ziar Kanyad from Tolo News being attacked by the Taliban. Can you talk about what's happening to journalists? Is this typical right now?
It's not necessarily. It's not entirely typical. It's not an exception. Obviously, journalists have always had a hard time in this country. And at this point, everyone is just, they're essentially trying to see how far they can go.
What happened to him?
Basically, he was outside in the middle of the street in a very populated area of the city, 10:30 in the morning in broad daylight. He was just basically interviewing daily wage workers. He wasn't there was no politician, no soldier, nothing controversial. He was just asking them about the economy when a white armored Land Cruiser stopped, beat him up, beat up his cameraman, his equipment. When they pulled out their media cards, they insulted them, beat them up even more, started hitting them with the butt of their rifles. They were doing nothing controversial whatsoever. And that's the scariest part, is that everybody is essentially at this point over the last 10 days trying to test the waters to see, what is too far for these people and how to see if they will live up to, because, they kept saying the media is free and the media can operate and we want them to operate and all. But, when things like this happen, again, as I said, it was broad daylight in the middle of the city. They were interviewing daily wage workers. There was nothing even remotely controversial about
Ali,
it.
finally, are you planning to stay in Kabul?
I hope to be able to stay as long as possible. The situation, we have to see if the Taliban lives by its word, if it protects us, if it allows for some semblance of democracy and freedom of speech, if they don't continue to intimidate and harass and beat up journalists, and they let us to allow us to operate freely. Of course, why would I want to leave my country? I've been lucky. Today I was able to go visit so many victims and tell their stories to the world. And if I'm forced out by them, by their actions, then who will be here to tell those stories and to make sure that they get broadcast and published everywhere as possible?
Ali Latifi, I want to thank you for being with us. Afghan journalist based in Kabul, correspondent for Al Jazeera English. Stay safe. Coming up, who is ISIS-K? We'll speak to Haroon Rahimi, assistant professor of law at American University of Afghanistan. Stay with us.
تنها گذاشتمت من از تو جدا شدم من از تو جدا شدم من ای نوبهار من ای نوبهار من افغانستان من ای روح و جان من
Afghanistan by Badel Safi. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue to look at the crisis in Afghanistan, a day after at least 95 Afghans and 13 U.S. troops were killed after a pair of suicide bombings in Kabul, just outside Hamid Karzai International Airport, the militant group ISIS-K has taken responsibility. We're joined in Istanbul, Turkey, by Harun Rahimi, assistant professor of law at the American University of Afghanistan. He was en route back to Kabul 2 weeks ago when he heard the news of the Taliban takeover and stayed in Turkey. He tweeted Thursday, "Please don't ask me for the foreseeable future how I'm doing. I am not doing well. No Afghan is." Professor Rahimi, welcome back to Democracy Now! Who are the ISIS-K?
So there are different ways to answer that question. You can look at their ideological leaning. You can look at their fighters, composition of their fighters. You can look at their objectives, and you would come up with different answers. You can look at their logistical kind of routes and their methods and come up with different answers. Ideologically, it's a group that is often called, that subscribe to a specific brand of Islamist kind of politics called Salafism. It's a reactionary modern phenomenon that seeks to reestablish the reimagined Muslim past. They often are very critical of everyone. They are Puritan. They are critical of all other sects of Islam. Whatever Muslim that thinks differently than them is a major target for them. They target Shias and other Muslims who disagree with them on any matter, and they've actually considered them the close enemy compared to distant enemy, which will be the West, or Americans. In terms of their fighters, they don't have a lot of fighters in Afghanistan. It was a branch of the infamous ISIS, which emerged in Syria and Iraq, but kind of a regional branch of it emerged in Afghanistan because of some of the connections that existed historically between eastern part of the country and the Arab world, and that through which the Salafism, that kind of particular understanding of Islam, had spread to the eastern part of the country. Some Arab fighters, some foreign fighters, including Arab fighters, when the ISIS was disseminated in Iraq and Syria, came there, and there were also some local Afghans who joined them because they felt more ideological alignment with them, or they saw it as an opportunity to join a group that was seen by many as resource rich at the time. In terms of objectives, they are very as I said, they are very against all other types of Muslims who disagree with them. They have fought with Taliban. They had many fights. They also fight, they target Shias, which are a sect of Muslims in Afghanistan, make a large minority in the country. They fought the government of Afghanistan as well. Right now, they seem to portray the Taliban as allies of the United States, and they wish to target both, as they did in the last attack, the horrendous attack on Kabul airport. So, I mean, there are different ways to answer that question, but it's a complex reality underground. How powerful it is, many have concluded that it's not that powerful anymore after it was beaten down by the Taliban, the government, and international allies, international forces. There still has some followers, sleeper cells in urban areas, because ISIS tends to recruit more kind of educated, middle-class, young kind of members compared to the rural base of Taliban. So it has a number of sleeper cells for sure in Kabul, And several of those obviously were responsible for the attack we saw yesterday.
On August 14th, when Taliban swept into the vacuum in Kabul, they executed Abu Omar Khorassani, the imprisoned former head of the Islamic State of South Asia, of ISIS-K. They were freeing people in the prison. They pulled him out. He'd been there apparently for years, and they executed him. Also explain what Khorasan, ISIS-K for Khorasan, and his name Khorassani stands for.
So Khorasan is kind of a region. You have to realize that the ISIS does not believe in nation states. So they believe in a caliphate that has a universal claim. So everywhere in the world falls within the realm or the jurisdiction of the caliphate. But they had regional kind of representation, often with the name of region as a qualifier. The name Khorasan refers to the eastern part of the Muslim empire, when Islam was an empire, and covers regions like Iran and Afghanistan. And they're using the older name that referred to that part of the world in relationship with the past Muslim empire. Obviously, it has symbolic significance. They are, again, as I said, they are reimagining a Muslim past in modern times as a way to mobilize often disenfranchised and alienated Muslim youth who are angry for different reasons, for the with the claims and hopes of reestablishing some past lost glory, which is obviously a reconstructed and reimagined past. That's why the terminology and the names often have those kind of symbolic past pedigree.
With President Biden vowing revenge for the suicide attacks, do you see the U.S. and Taliban working together? ISIS-K is also the enemy of Taliban, as we know, to target them.
Absolutely. I mean, supposedly they have already. The United States Army military said they had been exchanging information, sanitized information, meaning information that were often sometimes may not be full information, but some information was passed on to the Taliban to help them prevent such attacks. And the U.S. military claims that some attacks were prevented through those information sharing. And there is moving forward, Taliban are the de facto government on the ground, and the counterterrorism is going to be the main issue remaining from the U.S. perspective. And the only partner they have on the ground, really, given that they have withdrawn, they are going to be withdrawing all troops, would be the Taliban. And it seems like the U.S. is counting on Taliban's self-interest, to use Biden's words, to see them as a possible partner. An odd partner, but still a partner in their counterterrorism attack, at least especially with regard to ISIS-K, because you have to realize there are other terrorist groups active in the region who have better relationship with the Taliban, and there is no enmity between them. For example, Al-Qaeda still has strong ties with the Taliban. There's alignments there. There are many groups that Pakistan, for example, considers a terrorist group. There are many groups that Central Asian countries consider terrorist groups. There are groups that China considers terrorist groups that are active in the region and have good relationship with the Taliban. So Taliban would not be seen as a strong, robust partner in counterterrorism in general, but with regard to ISIS-K, it seems like there have been some cooperation, and moving forward, they will be seen, Taliban will be seen as a partner that can be relied upon in Afghanistan.
Also, very quickly, the Taliban have not announced their government in Afghanistan. Are they having trouble pulling together this coalition of theirs?
I mean, the Taliban are very good at not having public dissent. So if there are disagreements inside the movement, they tend to remain inside the movement. There could be other reasons why they haven't announced their government. One is that there are still U.S. troops present on Afghan soil. So the symbolism of announcing a government while the airport is under control of the United States would not be something that I think they wish for. So if the U.S. troops leaves by the August 31st and they still have a problem announcing government, for example, September 1st, 2nd, 3rd, then I think it will be cause for more serious internal frictions. Right now, I'm sure there are internal kind of frictions. It is not a monolithic, and there are different groups. For example, Haqqani networks and the southern Taliban from Kandahar and Helmand have been in tensions with each other. Kabul is dominated by the Haqqani network, which is kind of a subgroup within the Taliban that controls Kabul at the moment. So there are disagreements, but they've been good at resolving them and keeping cohesion. And the fact that they haven't announced the government yet, I don't think is a strong evidence of severe internal divide, just because of the fact that the U.S. is still in Afghanistan, and Taliban would not have announced the government with the U.S. with the Kabul airport being under control of Taliban.
And
it would
finally,
just not happen.
Haroon, are you planning at any point soon to go back to Afghanistan? I know the president of American University of Afghanistan, your university in Bickford, apparently has fled the country, according to the Wall Street Journal, and others. Will you be coming back?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, just to continue my mission of educating Afghan youth, and also just to go back home. That is where my home is. That's where everyone I love is. I don't have a large family outside of Afghanistan in any meaningful way. All my family is inside Afghanistan. As long as it's safe and I can be reasonably assured that I will not be harmed and targeted personally, I would definitely go back.
Haroon Rahimi, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Assistant Professor of Law at American University in Afghanistan. He was en route to Kabul when he heard the news of the Taliban takeover, and at this point has stayed in Istanbul, Turkey. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As thousands of Afghans attempt to flee Afghanistan before the U.S. withdrawal on August 31st, we turn now to look at how the Trump administration made it harder for Afghans who worked with the United States to apply and receive what is known as a SIV, a special immigrant visa. One former top aide to Mike Pence has placed the blame on Trump's xenophobic advisor, Stephen Miller. Olivia Troy recently tweeted, quote, "There were cabinet meetings about this during the Trump administration where Stephen Miller would peddle his racist hysteria about Iraq and Afghanistan. He and his enablers across government would undermine anyone who worked on solving the SIV, special immigrant visa issue, by devastating the system at DHS and state," she said. In recent weeks, Stephen Miller has repeatedly appeared on Fox News to criticize efforts to resettle Afghans in the United States.
The Taliban has all of the control of the government now. So the notion that people could just show up at a checkpoint and demand resettlement into the United States, and we could have any idea about their background, their belief system, where they come from, now that the U.S.-backed government has fallen, it's just an impossibility. Resettling in America is not about solving a humanitarian crisis. It's about accomplishing an ideological objective to change America.
That is Stephen Miller on Fox. We're joined now by Olivia Troy. She worked as a Homeland Security and counterterrorism advisor to Vice President Mike Pence until she resigned in August of last year. She's now the director of the Republican Accountability Project. Olivia Troy, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Can you talk more about, I mean, you were in the room. So talk about what the Afghan visa process is. We're talking about now a law passed by Congress. They have to go through something like 14 steps. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And to hear Stephen Miller sort of just disregard the fact that these people are vetted so extensively. I mean, the process is cumbersome and it is challenging, despite the Trump administration's attempts to really gut the entire thing. But, you know, they have to be sponsored by either the military commander at the time or the person they were working for. They have to get a letter, a recommendation from them. And then it's a series of steps. They go through health checks. They go through vetting. They go through background checks. I mean, this isn't something that just happens overnight. It is a cumbersome process that lasts at least several months. But in this situation, what we've had is that many of these people were in the pipeline for years, just waiting to get through the process, and they never saw results.
So describe a scene, describe a meeting that Stephen Miller was in, talking about these Afghan allies. Now, he is continuing to talk about this to this day.
But Stephen Miller does not hide the fact that he is anti-immigrant, anti-refugee. This is something that he has been consistent about from day one of the Trump administration when they took office. And whether it was issuing the travel ban, as it's referred to, or in that travel ban, it called for a full stop of the refugee process to do security reviews and review vetting. Well, I sat in those meetings when we discussed many of these scenarios. And in these meetings, it was brought to the attention, especially before cabinet meetings and in senior staff meetings at the National Security Council, the importance of protecting these translators, these interpreters, these U.S. allies that have served on the ground with us and who needed to get through the process expeditiously. And Stephen Miller would say, well, these are terrorist cells in the making if you bring them here. He would say, these are going to be, what is it that you want? You guys want a bunch of little Iraqs throughout the United States. You want a bunch of stands everywhere in the country. And it was so offensive to many senior military commanders and generals, brass, military brass, offensive to intelligence career people like myself.
Who spoke up? Can you talk about General Mattis, for example, when he couldn't attend a meeting?
Yes. So and he wrote a memo specifically about the P2 program on Iraqis. And I think this is happening in 2018 when we were discussing the refugee ceiling cap. And Stephen P2
program is similar to SIV, right?
Yes, exactly. And this conversation, we were talking about SIV processes. We're talking about the P2s for Iraqi translators, many of these who had been in the pipeline for years already. And so General Mattis is not able to attend this cabinet meeting on the refugee ceiling discussion. And so he writes a memo. And he writes this memo because he wants it to go on record and he wants it distributed at the meeting because he's concerned about what is going to happen when people come into the room. What is Pompeo going to do? Will he cave to the likes of Stephen Miller and his ilk? And he was right to be concerned because in this discussion, Stephen Miller pontificates once again and pushes this narrative of fear-mongering about what's going to happen if we bring these people here. And Mattis pushes back through his memo and makes sure that he's on record that if we do not protect this population, that if we don't get them through the process, this is a serious matter of national security, because what message are we sending to the world?
You were a special advisor to Vice President Pence. Did you feel you could stand up to Stephen Miller?
Yes, but you always had to do it in a very calculated manner, because when you do take a stand, unfortunately, he did have the power to remove people from their positions. He pushed a number of many of my competent colleagues out, State Department, Foreign Service officers who were serving across the National Security Council, some of them known to be pro-refugee and pro-SIVs and pro-P2s. And many of these people get pushed out of the National Security Council and they're replaced by Stephen Miller allies. And so what I did was I worked closely with my colleagues to figure out how we were going to navigate this careful situation. And I briefed former Vice President Pence about the scenario. I told him that I was meeting with numerous organizations who were raising serious concerns about what was happening here, whether it was budget cuts for the refugee resettlement programs for Afghans and Iraqis and other refugees. And they were asking the right question. They were saying, what is happening here? What's happening at the State Department? Well, when I dug into this and I actually go and meet people at the State Department, I find myself faced with one of Stephen Miller's right-out allies, one of his strongest supporters. And it all sort of comes together for me. And I come back and say, well, I don't know how we're going to counter what's happening here across the U.S. government when we have a group of people that are actively working to undermine the entire system.
In a statement to the New York Times, Stephen Miller responded to your accusations, saying the sole reason anyone is stranded in Afghanistan is because Joe Biden stranded them there in the single most imbecilic act of strategic incompetence in human history. And, of course, President Trump has weighed in, and he's attacking Biden, calling his responses imbecilic as well. Your response, Olivia?
Well, I think Trump had 4 years to do something about getting these people out of harm's way who were in the system waiting to be processed. And so I think what you see now is a scenario where, President Biden takes office. He comes in. They realize that the program is gutted. They've spoken about this before, where they come in and they realize that the program is definitely in need of resourcing and staffing. And so this is not something that you can just flip a switch and turn on overnight. It's a cumbersome process. And if it wasn't functioning the way it should have, which I know that it wasn't because I know this firsthand, it's going to take some time. And so you end up in a crisis situation now where you are trying to figure out how you're going to protect thousands of people whose lives are going to be at risk once we withdraw. If that were the case, and I know for a fact that the Trump administration was planning this withdrawal for several years now, why were they not actively prioritizing this population so that we wouldn't be in the situation we're in today?
Olivia Troy, I want to thank you for spending this time with us, former Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor to former Vice President Mike Pence, now Director of the Republican Accountability Project. When we come back, we look at how right-wing radio host Larry Elder, who once mentored a young Stephen Miller, could become the next governor of California if voters back a recall of Gavin Newsom. Back in 30 seconds.
Talking to my neighbors, listening to my friends. Everybody's hurting. When's it gonna end? Hard times.
Hard Times by Chris Stone, Kingfish Ingram. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we turn to California, where an effort to recall Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom is underway in a special election that could also shape national politics. Conservative talk radio host Larry Elder is now the Republican frontrunner challenging Newsom. Elder was a mentor to Stephen Miller, the xenophobic, anti-immigrant former Trump advisor. As the race heats up, President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris were set to travel to California to support Newsom. Harris has canceled a campaign event planned for today after the attacks in Afghanistan. Ballots have already been mailed to all registered California voters who have until September 14th to answer two questions. Should the governor be recalled? And if they vote yes, who should replace him? If more than 50% say yes, the governor should be recalled, the candidate with the most votes becomes the new governor. Newsom's leading challenger, Larry Elder, gave Stephen Miller one of his first platforms, as our next guest, Jean Guerrero, writes about in her book, Hate Monger, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, and the White Nationalist Agenda, which is out in paperback this week. Jean is a Los Angeles Times columnist who's written several columns about the recall race. Last week, she wrote, if Larry Elder's elected, life will get harder for Black and Latino Californians. Her latest column, headlined, Gavin Newsom has been one of the most pro-Latino governors in California history, and he's under attack for it. She joins us from San Diego, California. Jean, welcome back to Democracy Now! First, explain this extremely unusual, arcane process in California, how Governor Newsom could be recalled if 51% of people vote against him, but the person who replaces him, which could be Larry Elder, could get something like 18% of the vote.
Exactly. It is an incredibly anti-democratic election. Even if, Larry Elder only gets, as you mentioned, like far fewer votes than Gavin Newsom.
Just the plurality he needs against the other opponents.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
He would just need a plurality against the other opponents. A
plurality, exactly. And it's incredibly dangerous. I mean, this whole thing started with anti-immigrant nativists in California who were upset about the pro-immigrant, pro-Latino policies that Gavin Newsom was putting in place. It started with a former deputy sheriff named Orrin Heatley who on Facebook had called for planting microchips in immigrants and comparing them to animals. So those are the people who started the recall. It only gained traction after Gavin Newsom was spotted in a restaurant having dinner with some people that he knew, and he wasn't wearing a mask. He admits that was a mistake, and he owns that mistake. But Republicans have used that as propaganda to get support for this recall, and there's been a lot of misinformation around it, but also just general discontent about the pandemic that people are sort of putting on Governor Gavin Newsom. The problem is that the alternative to Newsom is is Larry Elder, who has received so far the most support. And he is a right-wing talk show host who, as I write in my book, mentored Stephen Miller, the anti-immigrant nativist who is the reason that people in Afghanistan who died could still be alive today if he hadn't spent 4 years blocking the admission of refugees and bragging about it, as recently at a conservative conference, saying that he was very proud to have slashed refugee admissions to historic lows. Larry Elder introduced him to this idea that it's not racist to deny the fact of systemic racism, and he's put out this idea to the delight of many white audiences. Larry Elder has that he's this black man, and because he's black, he can deny the fact of systemic racism, and he uses false statistics from a white supremacist named Jared Taylor, who, as I write in my column, he repeatedly cited in early writings. As recently as 2016, he was pulling content from a white nationalist website called VDare. So this is the person, he wants to attack all of the progress that California has made on immigrant rights. He wants to attack sanctuary laws. He wants to attack healthcare for undocumented immigrants. He wants to attack investments in public schools that Gavin Newsom has made that have hugely benefited communities of color. So he basically wants to take California back to the 1990s, when we saw an incredibly anti-immigrant and anti-Black decade in California.
So Larry Elder says if he is elected governor of California, he will repeal mask and vaccine mandates immediately. This is Elder.
I become governor, assuming I appreciate the optimism, sir. When I become governor, assuming there are still mandates for vaccines and mandate for face masks, they will be repealed before I have my first cup of tea.
Jean Guerrero.
This idea of repealing all mask and COVID vaccine mandates is incredibly concerning to communities of color in California who have already borne the brunt of this pandemic in terms of death toll and in terms of everything. Everything that he's planning to do on a broad level in relation to COVID, in relation to climate change, for example, he says that he doesn't want to do anything about climate change. He even believes in investing in more fracking. All of these things would disproportionately impact the most marginalized communities in California, who have made significant progress in recent years, thanks to governors like Gavin Newsom prioritizing their needs and really listening and sitting down and hearing them out. But it's so important to understand that what's happening in California could have national repercussions. We're talking about a state that has led the charge against Trumpism, has led the charge in terms of immigrant rights and protecting immigrant communities, helping immigrant communities feel safe, interacting with the police and reporting crimes without fear of deportation. We're talking about a state that has made significant advances on racial justice, a deep blue state. If the Republicans succeed in flipping that state with this anti-democratic election, it will have catastrophic implications nationally in terms of immigration reform in Congress. It could stall that. It would embolden other anti-immigrant, xenophobic governors in other states to really go after the Latino community. And it's just a part of the Republican Party's effort to just overturn democracy and the will of the voters through whatever it means.
Jean Guerrero, you wrote, the headline of your latest piece in the LA Times, Gavin Newsom has been one of the most pro-Latino governors in California history, and he's under attack for it. You've also said that Democratic outreach to Latino voters on the California recall election is not working. So, do people even realize this is happening?
No, they don't. That's the problem, is the communities who have the most to lose right now are kind of checked out because of the fact that we have suffered so much under the pandemic. I mean, just, essential workers who've had to keep going to work and they have fatigue from the pandemic. They have fatigue from Trumpism and the rise in hate crimes that occurred under the administration. So a lot of young Latinos in particular who I've been speaking with are just kind of tuning this out. Like, it's just too much for them. But it's so important that they are the ones, they need to turn out in order for this election to not overturn the will of the voters. I mean, if the only people who turn out are the far right white supremacist minorities in California, then we have a serious problem for these communities. And the problem is that even though Newsom has been doing incredible work for these communities, they haven't done a good job of messaging all of the advances that have been made, including unprecedented investments in our public education system, providing 2 years of free community college for first-time students, lowering the cost of textbooks, really great things that benefit not just undocumented Latinos, but Latinos, working class Latinos, and communities of color overall. So there needs to be a better job of messaging how horrible this could be, even just as far as like the rhetoric alone that Larry Elder would bring into our state. He told the Los Angeles Times, as I wrote in my column, that he plans to use the quote unquote bully pulpit, that he doesn't believe in humanizing terms like undocumented or immigrant. He wants to use, harsh terms like illegal aliens. And that would just send people back into the shadows and reverse the incredible progress that has been made in this state. And it would embolden the same in state after state after state. So it is so important for people to vote. And if you're not in California, tell your friends who are in California to vote no, because this could have serious implications.
Jean, talk about the implications for the balance of the Senate as well. Of course, it was Gavin Newsom who chose Kamala Harris's replacement when she became vice president. Now you're talking about Dianne Feinstein, and talk about the significance of if her seat is vulnerable and what would it mean in this period if there were a Republican governor.
Exactly. So the governor has the power to appoint a replacement for Dianne Feinstein if anything were to happen to her. If she were to retire or if anything else happened to her, she's elderly and so that is a real possibility that he would appoint someone who does not represent the values of California or Californians, and would tip the balance of the Senate. So it would make it impossible for President Biden to push through the policy goals that he's put forth in terms of infrastructure, in terms of helping, communities across the United States in ways that the Republicans oppose. So there are real implications. Like even though it would just be a year and a half in office and they would probably be voted out in the next election, they could do significant harm by, Larry Elder says that he plans to use his veto power to cut funding to all of these programs that he opposes, including healthcare for our undocumented seniors, which has allowed them to stay alive. And many of the Latinos here, we have mixed status families, so this affects us all.
Jean, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Jean Guerrero is Los Angeles Times columnist. Her latest column, Gavin Newsom's been one of the most pro-Latino governors in California history, and he's under attack for it. She's author of Hate Monger, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, and the White Nationalist Agenda. It's out in paperback this week. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is produced with Renee Fels, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Messiah Reds, Nermeen Sheikh, Mary Terracena, Tammy Warnoff, Tarina Nadura, Sam Alcoff, Tamari Studio, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, and Adriana Contreras. Our general manager is Julie Crosby. Special thanks to Becca Staley. I'm Amy Goodman. Stay safe. Wear a mask.